Hi semua. Now let's talk about cells that are grouped into animal tissues. When we talk about the multicellular organisms such as animals and even humans, there will be many cells that will be having similar functions, and these cells will be organized, will be grouped into a specific type of tissue. For example, in the animals, neurons or cells that are involved in transmitting information in the form of impulse will be grouped together to form the nerve tissue. And so, this will be the animal tissues that we need to learn. The first type will be the epithelial tissue. This will be the tissue that will be covering parts of the body. Meanwhile, if the tissue is important to transmit signals in the form of impulse, then this should be known as the nerve tissue. Next will be the muscle tissue, which generally involves in movement. And there are three types of muscle tissues that we need to know. The first type will be the striated muscle that will be normally attached to skeleton or the bones. And the second type will be the cardiac muscle, which is located only in the walls of the heart. And this is very important for the movement, for the contraction of the heart in order to pump the blood throughout our body. The third type of muscle tissue will be the smooth muscle, which are normally found at the walls of internal organs such as the stomach, the intestine, the esophagus, and even the uterus in females. And another type of animal tissues will be the connective tissues. There are several types of connective tissues actually, but we need to know three major types of connective tissues. Number one will be the blood, which is very important in transportation. The second type will be the compact bone tissue, which is important to protect the organs and also for muscle attachment. And the third type will be the hyaline cartilage, which is important to provide flexible support. Now let's move to the epithelial tissues, and we will start with the cells of the epithelial tissues that are also known as the epithelial cells. If the cells are flat and thin, then we call this type of epithelial cell as the squamous epithelial cells or the squamous epithelium. But if the shape of the cells are like a box or cube shape, then we can call this as the cuboidal epithelial cell. However, if the cell is elongated like this, like a column, then we can call this type of cell as the columnar epithelial cell. Now, what about the epithelial tissues? There are many types of epithelial tissues. It all depends on the type of epithelial cells and also concerning how many layers of cells that can be found. If we look at this tissue on the left hand side, we should notice that this tissue consists of the flat and thin squamous epithelial cells, and there is only one layer of these cells. And so, this tissue is known as the simple squamous epithelial tissue. Why squamous? Because of the squamous epithelial cells. Why simple? Because there is only one layer of cells. And this type of tissue can be found lining the lungs, for example, at the walls of the alveolus. And since this tissue is very thin and there's only one layer of cells, then this is very suitable to allow the process of gas exchange in the lungs area. However, if there are several layers of the squamous epithelial cells, then we can call this type of tissue as the stratified squamous epithelial tissue. And this stratified squamous epithelial tissue can be found lining the walls of the esophagus. Since there are many layers of cells, this is very suitable to protect this part of the body. And if the cells are cube-shaped and there is only one layer of cells only, then this tissue can be known as the simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. This can be found lining the kidney tubules. And if you look at this diagram over here, we can see that this will be the tubule inside the kidney. And we can see that the shape of the cells is cube-shaped and there is only one layer of cells covering this tubule of the kidney. And this type of epithelial tissue can be involved in the absorption of molecules at the kidneys. Now, if we look at this one over here, the cells are elongated, and so we know that this will be the columnar epithelial cells, and there is only one layer of cells for this tissue. Thus, this tissue can be identified as the simple columnar epithelial tissue, which can be found lining the small intestine in the body. And the function might be to absorb nutrients in the intestine. And if you notice, some of the columnar epithelial cell will be slightly different in structure. And this type of epithelial cell is actually modified to become the goblet cell. And the goblet cell is having a specific function to secrete mucus. This will allow a smoother movement of things inside the intestine. Now let's move on to the nerve tissue, and we will start with the cells of the nerve tissue, which can be also known as the neurons. There are three types of neurons. The first one will be the sensory neuron. This type of neuron will be located between the sensory organs and also the CNS. Example of sensory organs will be the eyes, the ears, and maybe our skin. Meanwhile, the central nervous system will be referring to the brain or even the spinal cord. The second type will be the motor neuron. This type of neuron can be found between the central nervous system and the effector organs. Example of the effector organs will be the muscle tissues or even certain type of glands. And between the sensory neurons and the motor neurons will be the interneuron, which is normally found within the central nervous system. And so, a nerve tissue consists of several neurons that are grouped together. And in this particular drawing, we can see that there are several neurons connected to each other, and we can also see the general structure of the neuron. Over here, we can see the cell body of the neuron. We can find the nucleus and also other organelles. And there will be extensions coming out from the cell body. This will be known as the dendrites. And there will be one extension that will be longer, and this will be known as the axon. Normally, the impulse will be transmitted away from the cell body, and the impulse will be transmitted along the axon towards other neurons maybe, or maybe to the muscles or even the glands. And if you notice, sometimes there will be this myelin sheath that will be covering parts of the axon. This myelin sheath is actually produced by a type of cell that is known as the Schwann cells, which is another type of cell that is also part of the nerve tissue. When there is myelin sheath covering parts of the axon, impulse will be generated, will be transmitted even faster along the axon. Why? Because the impulse will jump from one node of Ranvier to another node of Ranvier. Node of Ranvier will be the parts of the axon that is not covered by this myelin sheath. Now let's move on to the muscle tissues. As I have mentioned just now, there are three types of muscle tissues. The first type will be the smooth muscle tissue. And this type of tissue consists of the smooth muscle cell over here. The cells will be elongated and they will be having this spindle shape in which the cell will be having tapered ends like this. The cells will be unstriated without any striation, and you should also notice that there will be one nucleus at the center of each cell. This smooth muscle tissue will be very important for the involuntary movement at the digestive tract, such as this intestine or even the esophagus and even the uterus for the females. The second type of the muscle tissue will be the skeletal muscle tissue, which consists of the skeletal muscle cells over here. The cells are cylindrical in shape and they are also striated. That is why we can also call this skeletal muscle tissue as the striated muscle tissue. And for each cell over here, we can see that there are many nuclei that are located at the periphery of the cell. This skeletal muscle tissue will be very important for the voluntary movement of the bones. For example, we can control the movement of our arms. This is due to the action of the bicep and also the triceps, which are examples of the skeletal muscle tissue. The third type will be the cardiac muscle tissue, which consists of the cardiac muscle cells. The cells are also cylindrical and they are also striated. However, the striations are not as clear as the striation of the skeletal muscle tissue. And another difference is that these cells will be branched and the nucleus will be centrally located for each cell. Another important aspect of the cardiac muscle cell is that they are all myogenic. This means that the cells are able to generate their own electrical current in order to produce the contraction of the muscle tissue. And this type of muscle tissue is important for the involuntary contraction of the heart. And so, the heart will be able to pump the blood throughout our body. Now let's move to another type, and that will be the connective tissues. As you can see, there are several types of connective tissues for the animals and even the humans. But we need to focus on the bone tissue, the cartilage tissue, and also the blood tissue. Now let's go to the first type of the connective tissue, and that will be the compact bone tissue. The cells of the compact bone tissue are known as the osteocytes. They can be found within structures known as the lacunae. If you refer to this diagram, you will be able to see structures like this, and these are all known as the lacunae. Inside one lacuna, there will be the osteocyte, the cells of the bone tissue. And surrounding the cells of the bones will be the concentric layers of a hard matrix. The matrix will be very hard because it consists of several types of minerals. And this hard matrix can be known as the hydroxyapatite. Basically, the compact bone tissue is important to provide support and also protection for the body. The second type of the connective tissue will be the hyaline cartilage tissue, in which the cells are known as the chondrocytes. They are also found within the lacunae over here. The chondrocytes are also found within the matrix. However, for this cartilage tissue, the matrix will be rubbery and we call this rubbery type of matrix as the chondrine or the chondroitin sulfate matrix, which is actually secreted by the chondroblast, which is actually the early form for the chondrocyte. The general function for this connective tissue will be to provide flexible support. And the third type of the connective tissue will be the blood tissue. The cells for this blood tissue will be the red blood cell, also known as the erythrocytes, and also the white blood cell, which is also known as the leukocytes. These cells will be produced in the bone marrow. And the cells are also found within the matrix. However, the matrix is not hard, the matrix is not rubbery as well. Instead, the matrix of the blood tissue is very fluid, and we call this fluid type of matrix as the plasma of the blood. Generally, the function of this blood tissue is for the transport of respiratory gases, such as the oxygen and also the carbon dioxide. This is generally referring to the function of the red blood cell. At the same time, the blood tissue is also important for body defense, in which this will be referring to the function of the leukocytes, the white blood cell. Since we know that some of the leukocytes can be involved in the production of antibodies, and some will be involved in destroying pathogens such as virus and bacteria. And so, that is all about the animal tissues. We'll continue again in some other lessons. Bye-bye.